guys, Captain Blade J52 here with the Pilot Review Show, and we're doing a mini episode of sorts for you guys today. And you folks know me on the show mainly as the camera guy, with most of the episodes being shot from my particular perspective. Now, with that, we also try to keep the show moving as efficiently as we possibly can, although from time to time we might get bogged down a little bit discussing major changes or new features that are about to come down the pipes, or maybe they've even just released at the time of filming that particular episode. Now, in each of our episodes, we like to include a budget build for folks, in addition to sprinkling little tips and tricks about piloting all throughout as well. Now, these budget builds are meant to be very basic, cohesive builds that people can put together that will let them get through most of the content in-game without having to break the bank, or max out their credit cards, or treat the game like a second job in order to have a good build. Now, these builds are also meant to be ones that people can put together in roughly a week or less, typically less than that, so you're not having to wait until you're older than Methuselah before you can actually use it, because, well, that's no fun for anybody. Now, with this, there's typically 3 different types of budget builds that we cover, once in a while doing maybe a subtype of those particular budgets. Now, the 3 main ones that we have are, first up, our bare bones budget. Now, our bare bones budgets assume a maximum spending limit of 2 million energy credits, and all other items must be free or cheap as possible. So at this stage, you're not really going to see any lockbox or low-buy gear or anything like that, unless somehow it fits within the 2 million easy spending limit, or occasionally we may have the person that says, hey, I already had this laying around, can we go ahead and include that with the build? In which case, then, you might occasionally see it. But most of what you're going to see at this level is things from your story mode missions that you can pick up for free just by rerunning the missions or playing through the various missions in the game, and occasionally some reputation gear as well, because it doesn't cost anything to refine the dilithium to help build the item, nor does it cost anything to pick up the reputation marks in order to build the item either. You just have to go out there and grab them. Now, the next step up from bare bones is our mid-range budgets. Now, once you get to this level, we're assuming anyway that you have a bit more to invest into the build. We're assuming at this point a maximum spending limit of 30 million energy credits, and you have enough resources to take one single item up to its maximum rarity and level, which at the time of filming this is a Mark 15 Epic. Now, typically once you get to this level, you might see the odd lockbox item here or there because you've got a bit more to spend than you had at a bare bones level. Usually this may be the odd console or two, maybe a trait. It really depends on the build that we're putting together at the time. Then the next step up we have from mid-range is our higher-end builds. Now, once we get to the higher-end builds, we're assuming there's no upper EC spending limit, and if there is one, it's a very high limit. And we still assume, of course, you're able to take one item and max it out at this point. Now, once you get to the higher-end levels, this is when you start to see more of your lockbox, your low-buy gear, and your more expensive fleet items coming into play. Now, the higher end builds are meant to be sort of you're getting towards the higher end, you know what you want to do, and it's more of an ultimate representation type of thing. You're getting into more of what do you ultimately see the ship as being, and what do you really want it to become. That's kind of what the higher end builds are getting towards, but hopefully without still breaking the bank. Now, with these builds, most of the time, regardless of budget level, one thing will remain the same, and that is our standard skill tree setup that we recommend to people. Now, we do offer customized skill builds upon request, however, to help us streamline things and make it easier for folks as well as ourselves a little bit, there's a standard skill tree setup that we typically recommend to folks that'll let them adapt to virtually any situation in front of them with any starship with little to no issues. Now, our longtime viewers know that we don't typically go into detail on the main episodes themselves as to why we picked the certain skills that we did for folks, but instead, myself or the host doing the build that week will typically just mouse over the various sections for a couple of moments for folks that want to just copy something and go. This is because it would significantly increase the length of our show times if we gave this explanation in every single episode. Now, because of this, you guys may have heard me or one of the other hosts mention that we have a video for you folks that actually want that technical explanation as to why we picked the certain skills that we did, and lately we've gotten a few questions about that, so we figured now's as good a time as any to finally get that out there for you folks. Alrighty guys, we're looking at our skill points here. You can see the first two tiers of skills that we have for Lieutenant and Lieutenant Commander. You can also see the overall total points breakdown that we have here. There's 14 into engineering, 14 into science, and 18 into tactical. Now, you can obviously tell that we're not using any of the quote-unquote ultimate abilities in this case. This is for a number of reasons. Some of the obvious ones being that not everybody's going to enjoy a full tactical build, not everybody's going to enjoy a full science build, or even a full engineering type of build. While they have value, we didn't want to go with that because we didn't want people to feel like they're being pigeonholed into one area or another. Now, even among the host, we approach things in-game from a lot of different build philosophies and mindsets. I typically play as more of a tank, whereas Timberwolf is more of a in-your-face type of damage dealer. He likes to get in there, mix it up with foes, see how much damage he can do. Then you've got Creo, who plays very similarly to him, except a bit more aggressive. Then you've got Neela, who's more of a carrier person, does a lot of stuff with science as well. You've got Artie, who's a bit of an RP guy, and then also, anytime I've seen him, he loves to fly around on a lot of really zippy escorts, especially his Aquarius. Then you've got Boss Man, who is he uses a lot of unorthodox builds, I guess is the best way of saying it. Things that people might not traditionally think of as being viable, and is also really good with his science builds. So even among the hosts, we have a lot of competing build philosophies and ways of doing things, and whenever we came together to try to put this build in effect, to come up with something basic for people to use that we would recommend, we wanted something that would be more well-rounded. We didn't want folks to feel like they're being pigeonholed or forced into any certain type of playstyle. If somebody likes, a bit more science, we didn't want them to feel like we were trying to force them down the tactical route or engineering route. And the same for people that may like more engineering or more tactical. And we wanted people to be able to adapt to virtually anything in front of them without gimping them in any other areas. Basically, we wanted it to have good knockdown power, but also keep them alive at the same time. Now, beginning with our lieutenant level skills here. Words. Yeah, words. So apparently I can't words today. But starting with our hull restoration and our shield restoration, we're going to look at these both simultaneously because they do essentially the same thing, except one does it for your shields, one does it for your hull. Now, we bring up the hull restoration tooltip here. You can see it grants a 25% bonus to your base hull healing. Now, to keep the number simple in my head, let's assume we have a power that grants 1,000 points of hull healing each time you use it. Well, now, instead of granting just the base 1,000 points before any other buffs and everything are taken into account, this is going to grant you an additional 25% healing in that aspect. So now, instead of just the base 1,000, you're getting 1,250 points of healing. which is fairly good. And then you can see we have the same thing for our shield restoration as well. So we only put 1 point into this for a couple of reasons. We felt that it was definitely worth having and picking up that extra base healing, but you can see here if we pull up the second tier point, you don't get nearly as much by picking up the second points or even the third points. I believe it's only a 17.5% additional increase by picking up the second point, and then if you pick up the third, you're only getting an additional 7.5. So you're not getting the greatest amount of boosting by the time you get into your second point and even your third point. We definitely felt the first points were worth having because they're still a decent boost, but the second and third points, although it is a boost, it's not going to be nearly as potent as some of the other abilities you can pick up elsewhere in the skill tree, or perhaps even through traits or something else you can get on the ship itself. So basically it's a case of why only have this tiny of a benefit when we can have an even greater benefit elsewhere, if that makes sense to people. Then getting into our other abilities, we have our hull capacity and our shield capacity. Again, we're going to look at these both at the same time because it's the same thing, except one is for hull, one is for shields. And you can see we picked up 2 points into this area. This is going to give us additional maximum hull and additional maximum shields. So by having our first point into hull cap and shield cap, that's a 15% increase. And then whenever we pick up our second points, that's going to give us an additional 10.5%. So we're getting 25.5% bonus hull and bonus shield capacity. So that's slightly better than 1/4, or that's around 1/4 additional capacity that you're getting for free, which is fairly significant. And we didn't pick up the third points because, again, that's only going to be an additional 4.5%. So it's not going to be that much, and you're not going to feel a 4.5% difference. You're really not in a case like that. So it kind of boils down to what we said prior. Why only have a minor benefit here when you could have something greater elsewhere? And for those that do want to pick up that additional 4.5%, you can certainly do that. And there's actually buffs and abilities out there that will grant you that 4.5%, except it'll do it without having to invest a skill point, thus you free that up to be invested into something else elsewhere that will give you potentially a greater benefit. Then the next thing we have is our energy weapon training. We're getting into our tactical skills at this point. Now our energy weapon training is going to, whenever you max it out, give you a 50% increase in your total damage. Now that's going to give you, I believe this is category 1 if I'm not mistaken, so that's going to give you a fair chunk more additional knockdown power than what you had before. So this is basically just free damage by picking this up. Now you'll notice that we also didn't pick up the projectile weapon training to increase our projectile weapons. That's because for most builds out there, unless you're doing something highly specialized like a torpedo build and everything that does a lot of torpedo-based damage or a lot of projectile-centric damage, you're going to get more bang for your buck out of your energy weapon training because most of your damage in that case is going to come from your energy weapons. Now, this doesn't take into account things like science builds or things like that. But for quite a few builds out there, most of your damage is going to come from your energy weapons. And even if you have a singular torpedo on the build, it's still not going to be the main source of your damage. So you're going to get more by picking up your energy weapon training. Now if you know for a fact you're going to use a torpedo, or do a lot with a torpedo, you can definitely pick up the projectile training. But for our purposes, since we're going with a more rounded approach, trying to benefit the most people possible, we didn't invest into projectile training in this instance. Then, once we move down to our Lieutenant Commander, once we've unlocked that, you can see for our first set of points here, we have Electroplasma System Flow, Improved EPS Flow, and Impulse, or Full Impulse Energy Shunt. Now, whenever we look at this first thing here, we see it increases our total power transfer rate by 60%. Now, this basically means our different, like if you've ever hit your full impulse in game, you'll notice that it pulls power out of your shields, out of your weapons, and out of your auxiliary, and it dumps all of that power into your impulse engines. Whenever you disengage full impulse, that will transfer that power back to your shields, your weapons, and your auxiliary. Well, the rate that it moves between the systems, that's your EPS flow, and that's what that's buffing. This is going to make that move 60% faster. Then your improved EPS flow gives an additional 40% to that, so you've got essentially a 100% boost in this area. So that essentially means that your power is going to transfer twice as fast as it did before. Now this is going to be very good because that's going to allow your weapon power to regenerate more quickly, as well as your shields, your engines, and your auxiliary. And basically whenever you expend weapon power, it transfers back into your weapons a lot more quickly and is able to be used again. So this can give more knockdown power, more defensibility, and so on. And it is all around a great thing to have, and you're picking this up for free, which is very great. Now, for the full impulse energy shunt, you can see essentially what the tooltip says here. It provides direct bonuses to the transfer of power that occurs while using full impulse, allowing your weapons, shields, and aux systems to maintain higher power levels. By default, activating full impulse will set your engine subsystem power or subsystem target to 100, while all other subsystems drop to a target of 5. By investing into the shunt, these are increased to 125 for your engine power and 25 for all subsystems. Now, that seems like a good thing, and it actually is if you're having to move from place to place very quickly. But the only time you're really going to be able to use your full impulse is if you're out of combat. There's nothing in the game, at the time of filming this at least, that is going to let you use your full impulse while you're in combat. So this really isn't going to do a lot for you as far as knockdown power or even really defensibility. It basically just lets you have your engines not drain as much power whenever you're at full impulse. That's essentially all it does. And in our opinion, while if you're flying around a lot, sure, it's decent to have, but there's better options out there. And if you need power, there's definitely other options we're going to be looking at a bit later in our skill tree here. Then we have a point into our impulse expertise, which is going to give a 20% turn rate bonus and total speed increase to our ship. So that basically means it's going to be about 20% faster as far as its overall speed, and it's also going to have a 20% turn rate bonus, making it a bit easier to turn. Now this is about the equivalent of certain consoles out there that can buff your turn rate. Certain RCS consoles will give you about 40% turn rate. Now, we wanted to have one point into this because we never know what type of ship people are going to be flying. Some people may prefer the zippier escorts, whereas people like myself may prefer a bigger, beefier dreadnought or something along those lines. And we wanted to be able to give a bonus to people that prefer the bigger dreadnoughts and the smaller, zippier escorts alike. Now, the little zippy escorts that have a lot of turn rate anyway, they're not going to benefit as much from this, but they're still going to benefit from it some. And we didn't invest too many more points into it because we felt that you could make up that extra turn rate elsewhere if it's needed. But basically it's there to give something to the beefier ships, the heavier ships, and give a little something extra to the smaller ships at the same time. Now, the next skills we have are the control expertise and the drain expertise. Now, they do similar things. One affects your draining powers, one affects control-based powers. So we'll pull up let's do the basic level of control expertise. Now, control expertise will increase the effectiveness of control-based powers that you use, while also giving you resistance to those control powers as well. Now, this includes things like disables, holds, repels and pulls, confuses, placates, and turn rate and flight speed debuffs. And then it gives the formula there for people that are kind of curious. Now, rank 1 will give you a 30% boost to the effectiveness of your control powers and a 60% boost to the resistances of those same control powers being used against you. So it's basically a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of the resistances versus the effectiveness boost. So for every point you boost in effectiveness, you get twice that much in terms of resistances. Then if we look in the second level of it for the improved values, or the second, I guess, boosted level, you get 50% total control effectiveness boost and a 100% control resistance modifier. So basically it doubles your resistances and gives you a 50% boost to the effectiveness. Now this isn't going to make you immune to control effects. I know it says a 100% resistance modifier. All that does is double the resistances that you have now. That's not going to make you immune, like some people might think, but it's going to just give you a lot more than you otherwise would have had. Then we basically, for our drain expertise, it's the same thing, same values you can see, except it affects draining powers like shield drain or damage, certain power drains, subsystem offlines, and power transfer rate debuffs. So we wanted to give these in this instance because, well, you've got certain energy types out there like Polaron or Tetrion that have a drain-based proc to them. You have subsystem offline effects like the phasers have a proc in that aspect. There's certain powers that can drain shields, also drain power from people. Then, even if you're not going for a very science-heavy build, a lot of ships out there still have access to a gravity well, which can be used to control certain enemies, slow them down, and buy yourself and your team more time to take out certain objectives. So there's definitely value to be had, and even if you don't use any drain powers yourself, or you don't use any control powers, at the very least you're going to benefit from the resistances. So even if you're not using the powers yourself, you're still going to get some resistance against those powers being used against you. Now for the control side of things, we have the control amplification. And essentially what this does is whenever you use a control power on a foe, it's a minus 20 all damage resistance rating for 5 seconds. Now that on paper is very good. It's still something decent to be had today, but it says this effect can occur a maximum of once every 5 seconds. So you're not going to be able to stack this up. It is going to let you bypass some of the resistances, sure, but that involves you having a control power. And if you're a ship that, say, all you have is a gravity well, that's all you have, no way to cool it down or anything like that. So for 5 seconds you are hitting them a bit harder, but in this instance, while you are hitting them harder, we felt it was better to get something that was a bit more consistent. Something that you can have active all of the time, that's going to let you hit them harder all of the time versus only some of the time. if that makes sense to folks. Then we have the Drain Infection, which is basically going to deal some electrical damage to foes anytime you smack them with a Drain ability. Now, this is going to do a bit of damage to them, yes, anytime you use a draining-based power. However, it's not that great amount of damage. It's not something that you're going to write home about. If you're making a pure drain build, then yes, this is going to let you squeak a little bit extra out of it. But if you're not going super heavy into drain, then it's not really going to help you. And even then, in our personal opinion, there's better choices you can pick up in this particular instance without having to invest a skill point, thus taking away from something that could benefit you greater elsewhere. Then you have, for your tactical on the Lieutenant Commander tree, you have the Targeting Expertise and Defensive Maneuvering. Now, we only have 2 points into each of these. We'll start with our Targeting Expertise. Whenever you put 1 point into it, you get a 7.5 accuracy bonus, and then you get a 12.75 accuracy bonus at rank 2. And you get similar values for your defense here. For your defense, you get a 7.5 defense bonus, and then a 12.5% defense bonus total whenever you invest 2 points into this. Now, essentially, these are polar opposites of each other in terms of what they do. Whenever you're firing at a target, essentially it performs a defense versus accuracy check. If your accuracy is higher than their defense, it's pretty much guaranteed you're going to be able to hit them. If their defense is higher than your accuracy, you're going to have a bit harder time hitting those targets. Now, you're going to want to have a little bit of the targeting expertise anyway because of the accuracy penalties to things like fire at will, scatter volley, and similar types of firing modes. This is going to offset that accuracy penalty a pretty nice amount, and with certain bonuses you could pick up elsewhere, you'll be able to close that gap completely and not have to worry about it. Now, we didn't invest into the 3rd point because you're only getting an additional 2.25 accuracy or defense, and you can make that up elsewhere with a trait, with certain powers even, and you're not having to waste a skill point in that case for such a minuscule bonus. And honestly, for that 2.25 accuracy and defense, you're not going to feel it. You're really not going to feel the difference. So in this instance, although yes, they are buffs, it's another case of why have this smaller buff when you can have this much larger buff over here. And then your defensive maneuvering is basically going to make you harder to hit, which can potentially translate to a bit of damage reduction in the form of being able to not get hit in the first place, basically. Scrolled a little too far. Now we have our commander rank skills here. This is when we start getting into some of the more potent types of powers. Now we have our hull plating, which is going to be an across-the-board damage resistance boost to kinetic and the different energy types. So you can see that's a 9-point boost. Then if we go to our energized hull plating, that gives us a total of 15 energy damage resistance. So that's an additional 6 points there. And then if we pick up the ablative, that's an additional 6 points resistance to kinetic damage type effects. Now, a lot of people tend to pass over some of these. And we don't recommend that, at least for what we're doing. Reason being is because this is free damage reduction that you're going to have active all of the time, and is going to be very close to a neutronium alloy's worth of resistances without actually having to slot a neutronium alloy armor. So by picking it up in the skill tree here, this frees up a console slot you could potentially use for something else. And this is going to be active all of the time. it can never outright be permanently taken away from you. It can potentially be debuffed through temporarily, but you're never going to be without this permanently. It's always going to be there, and it's free damage reduction, which is going to let you stay alive a lot longer, which I think kind of speaks for itself. Now, we'll look at our shield regeneration and our damage control in a moment, and I'll explain why we didn't invest there, but let's go to our other skill point choices for the moment. First up, we have our shield hardness. Whenever we have our first point, it's a 50% increase to the damage negation modifier on shields. And then if we pick up our second point, it's an 85% damage negation modifier. So basically this is going to let us increase the amount of damage reduction that we have. This means our shields are going to be a lot more durable, they're not going to let nearly as much damage get through to the hull, and they're going to be able to soak up just that much more. And this comes close to, I believe this outright does double. Yep, it does double if you pick up the third point. Now, we only put 2 points into this because that extra 15%, it's definitely worth having, certainly, but we felt that some of the other benefits you can get later on in the skill tree outclass it. So although it is a damage reduction, again, it's coming to a case of why have this smaller benefit when you can have a greater one later? And even then, that 15% can be made up for through different traits, different powers, abilities, and so on. Then we come to our weapon amplification and specialization. Now, we've put all 3 points into these here because these are free critical chance and severity. In the case of amplification, it's a 40% severity boost. Now, I know that says a 20% on the screen, and then a 4% critical hit chance boost for specialization. Now, I know that these numbers, what I'm saying versus what the numbers are saying here, are different. That's because the tooltips on the skill builder here are actually wrong. They've not been updated. Now, whenever Season 13 rolled around, the total weapon specialization bonus you could get was capped off at 4%, and the bonus that you could get from the amplification, which is the critical severity version, was actually raised to 40%. So you're actually getting fairly significant increases in both areas, and they're definitely worth having. This is going to translate to pure knockdown power for your ship. That's going to give you greater chances at landing critical hits, and it's going to make those critical hits even nastier when they do go off. So, essentially, 40% additional critical severity, despite what the tooltip says here, and a 6%, or not a 6%, but a 4% critical chance boost for your specialization. So at the time of filming this particular video, just keep in mind these tooltips are wrong. This should actually be 40% for your severity, and if I could buttons, a 4% for your specialization and your critical hit chance. Now coming over to the damage control and the shield regeneration. The reason we didn't put anything into these particular abilities is because they don't really have any value. And in my personal opinion, they're the lowest tier abilities that you can possibly get. If there was a lowest tier of skill tree boost that you could get, this would be them. And we'll pull up the tooltip and I'll show you what I mean. This skill increases the rate at which your hull is passively repaired over time. Each point of damage control skill increases your regeneration rate by 1% of its base value. And then it gives the formula here. Starships begin with a regeneration rate of 0.5, which translates naturally to restoring 5% of your maximum hull every 8 seconds. Your regeneration rate in combat is 0.1. So that's going to cut that down to basically 1% in combat. Now, at the most, what you're looking at here is basically about a 3% thing. So you're looking at about a 3% boost to your hull regeneration in combat. So 3% of your hull back every 8 seconds. It is healing, yes, and then you've got the same thing here with the shield version. So it's going to be roughly 3%. So if you've looked on a shield generator and you see where it says so much regeneration per 6 seconds, that's essentially what these two skills are boosting. They're boosting that. And it's a passive thing, it's not something you can control, and a lot can happen in that 8 to 6 seconds. That 8 to 6 seconds can mean the difference between life and death in a particular queue. So, by the time you do wait out the 8 seconds, and you do get that extra bit of a boost, all it's going to take is one shot and you've lost it. It's like it was never there to start with. And you've invested potentially 3 skill points into it, and they're wasted. They're essentially wasted skill points in their current form. Now perhaps down the road we'll see a better iteration of this, but right now the damage control and the advanced shield regeneration are not worth slotting points into. The only time that we would ever recommend those is if you wanted to go for, say, the engineering ultimate or the science ultimate, and you had to invest the points so you could get to the ultimate ability. That's the only time we would ever recommend these, because otherwise, in our opinion, they're just not worth it, and that's pretty much universal throughout the entirety of the host. Getting into our captain areas, this is where we get into even more potent abilities. Now, there's one power that we're actually going to start with our science abilities in this case, because there's one power that we pretty much consider mandatory for anybody that's wanting to have a lot of knockdown power, and that is the long range targeting sensors. I'll spit it out in a minute. Now, we have all 3 points into this, and that's going to reduce your weapons drop-off penalty to 20%. Now, one thing that a lot of people may not be aware of is in Star Trek Online, the farther you are away from a target, you start to suffer a bit of weapon drop-off. And it gives the formula here on this. It says, by default, being far away from your foe can cause all energy weapons to lose up to 50% of their potential base damage. This penalty starts at 0% while at 2 kilometers or closer, and scales up to 50% loss when at exactly 10 kilometers from the target. Each rank of long-range targeting sensors reduces the penalty by 10%. So it starts with a base penalty of up to 50% damage lost by being farther away from the target. So naturally, you want that penalty to be as low as you can. And you can see here, this reduces it to a 40%. Then once you have all 3 points, you're only suffering a 20% penalty. And 20% penalty is a lot better than a 50% penalty. So this is going to mean you're going to keep more of your damage on the target, and you're going to be able to hit them a little bit harder as a result, giving you a bit more flexibility in how close you actually have to be to the target. So regardless of whether you're running as science, engineering, or tactical, this is something that, in our opinion, is mandatory, at least in the current form. Then we have 2 points into our exotic particles. This is going to give a bit of benefit to some exotic abilities that you might be able to pick up, like a gravity well or so on. And basically your exotic damage, it tells you here, it says, This skill increases the damage you deal with exotic damage abilities. This generally includes all damage effects which do not require a weapon activation in order to deal damage to an enemy. So this includes things like your gravity wells, your subspace vortexes, your warp plasma if you've seen somebody spew plasma from their warp nacelles, things of that particular nature. And it basically doesn't need, like it says, a weapon in order to throw it out there. So that's what typically falls under your exotic damage. And this is going to give, at rank 2, a 42.5% boost. So a lot of ships, like we were explaining earlier, will typically have access to at least one ability, like maybe a gravity well or something similar, and this is just going to give a bit more knockdown power to that kind of stuff. Now, some ships will benefit from it, some ships won't. It depends on the ship that we're working with. Then, for our engineering powers, we have our defensive subsystem tuning and offensive subsystem tuning. Now, each one will give a slight boost to certain power levels. Your defensive subsystem tuning will grant 4.8 power to your shields and your auxiliary power levels. So this is free power that you're getting just by having this active. So this is going to give 4.8 to your shields and aux, and then the offensive version gives 4.8 to your weapons and engines. Now, there is the option to further specialize into some of the different systems, such as there's a shield version, a aux version, a weapons version, and an engines version. And just like they sound, if say you picked up your weapon subsystem performance, that would grant an additional 3.2 weapon subsystem power. Now, we didn't further specialize in this instance because it's only to that one subsystem. You're getting 3.2 power to just one system, and honestly, you're not really going to feel that difference. You're not going to feel that difference in the long run. Now, it's definitely worth it if you don't have a point to spend elsewhere, you just want to slap something in there just because, you can definitely do that. But we felt that you could get better bonuses by investing those points that you could spend on one of these specialized abilities and invest them elsewhere and get a greater amount of power overall. And we'll explain that in just a moment. Now, for our final abilities on the Captain tier, you have your choice of hull penetration or shield penetration. And essentially, what they do is if you have hull penetration, you bypass a bit of their armor. At rank 3, you get a plus 10 armor penetration, which lets you bypass a good chunk of their armor. Then, if you have the shield penetration, that's an additional 10% shield bleed through. So that is percentage based. Now, there's arguments that can be made for and against either one of these skills. You know, if you're somebody that prefers the hull penetration, you could argue that, well, once the shields go down, the shield penetration is useless. It's not going to help you. And this is a static number. It's going to be guaranteed to give you that bonus. So when it says a 10 bonus, that means it's going to let you bypass essentially 10% of their armor. Or 10 points of value of their armor at least. So that's going to let you hit a bit harder, and it's a consistent bonus. Now, likewise, people that favor shield penetration can say, well, this is a percentage-based bonus, so it could potentially give you a lot more, and if you can't get through the shields anyways, then the hull penetration is useless. So that's just some of the arguments that could be made for or against either one. But in this particular instance, we went with the hull penetration because we felt if you're getting through their shields anyway, which typically a lot of the times you're going to have people there, if you're concentrating on one target especially, you're going to be able to get through at least one of their shield facings easily enough. And you're going to benefit a bit more from that in that instance from the hull penetration than strictly the shield penetration. There is no right or wrong answer as to which one of these two you prefer or which one you should use, but for our respective purposes, we chose to recommend hull penetration out of the two. Now, there are builds that run both, but in our opinion, that's not really necessary unless, again, you're going for something like the like an ultimate skill build type of thing, and you need the tactical points. Now, coming into our final tier of skill points, we have the Admiral tier. Now, first up, we have our Warp Core Potential. Now, by investing in our Warp Core Potential, we get a +3 to all subsystem power levels. So that means we're going to essentially get 12 points of power total off of this particular skill point. So that means our weapons are going to get a 3-point bonus, our shields are going to get a 3-point bonus, engines are going to get a 3-point bonus, and our aux is going to get a 3-point bonus. So there's going to be a bonus to be had in both areas, or in all of those areas. And this affects all 4 subsystems instead of just one. This particular skill is one reason why we didn't further specialize into the shield subsystem or one of these specific subsystems when dealing with offensive subsystem tuning or defensive subsystem tuning. Although you could do that, for the example I gave, is say you wanted to boost your weapons a little bit. You could put something in your weapon subsystem performance and get a 3.2 to your weapons, but why do that when you can come down here and put a point into core potential and boost all 4 of your subsystems? And if need be, you could even go into improved core potential and get an additional 2 power beyond that. So you're potentially looking at, assuming you maxed out your core potential, you're looking at a +5 to all of your subsystems. So potentially a +20 total amount of power that you could be getting. So again, it's a case of why limit yourself when you can have an even greater benefit by waiting later into the skill tree. Now, if you needed a bit more power at the lower levels, there is always the warp core efficiency that we could have picked up, but in this case, with our setup, we felt we had typically enough power to work with, and there's so many ways to get power in the game as is anyway, that if we're lacking in one specific subsystem or another, it's fairly easy to make up with that, or to make that up with different bonuses. Now, we have we'll go over the shield mastery abilities and also the coordination protocols as to why we didn't pick them up. Now, coordination protocols is going to basically buff your hangar pets. It's going to give them increased stats into their different areas and whatnot. Most ships are not going to be carriers, and unless you're flying a ship that's using a hangar bay that has pets that you could launch, this isn't really going to help you that much. And again, since we're trying to benefit as many people as we can with this build, we didn't feel that this would be the best choice. If you're somebody that you know you're going to be running a carrier, then this is something that you're going to want to look into, because it's going to make your carrier pets a lot more potent than they otherwise would be before. Then you have your shield mastery. And once every 20 seconds, you can negate a critical hit that is dealt to yourself. So you have that. Then you have 2 other abilities that work off of the shield mastery. You have shield absorption, up to 20% of incoming damage applied as shield healing. And then you have the shield reflection. On shield mastery, trigger up to 20% of incoming damage reflected back at the attacker. So these 2 points, the shield absorption and shield reflection, only work off of the shield mastery. So these are 3 points that would only benefit you once every 20 seconds. And depending on where you're at, who you're fighting, and so on, it's pretty much a guarantee you're going to get critically hit more than once every 20 seconds. Again, it depends on who you're fighting, the situation, and so on. But although this would negate a critical hit, potentially negate some damage coming in, give slight bits of healing, and extra damage thrown back at the attacker, you can only use it once every 20 seconds, and it's not going to benefit you that greatly in the long run. Now, it used to be a lot more potent, but with Season 13, it's not nearly as potent as it was before. So, it's not going to benefit you as much as something such as one of the, something like engineering readiness, or tac readiness, or science readiness would do. Which, speaking of which, we have our engineering readiness and our tactical readiness. And essentially what these are is free cooldown reductions to the different areas. We have 2 points into tac readiness, 2 points into engineering readiness as our final 4 points. Now, most ships out there are going to have access to usually at least 3 tactical powers. Then most of your ships out there are going to have access to at least, I would say, between 2 to 4 engineering powers. So we went with the engineering readiness, if I get words. We went with engineering readiness and tactical readiness as the final 2 skills here, because we felt this would benefit the most amount of powers. If you have extra points you can put into scientific readiness, if you're somebody that wanted to do that, then that's great. That's going to give you even greater cooldown reduction across the board. But for our purposes, we put our points into engineering readiness and tactical. Now, in the case of the tactical readiness, by having 2 points into that, that's a 17% cooldown reduction on all of your tactical powers that you're going to have no matter what. Now, this will stack with any other abilities that you may have that could further reduce your tactical cooldowns. A prime example is the morphogenic Polaron set. Just by having 2 pieces on there, that's an additional 15% at the time of filming this cooldown reduction to your major tactical firing modes. So you're essentially looking at a 32% reduction in terms of cooldowns to your tactical powers, combined with this and the 2-piece bonus. Then you have your engineering readiness. This is going to cool down your engineering powers by 17%. This can combo with things like auxiliary to battery and any other types of cooldown reduction you might have. So this essentially is going to let you cool down your engineering powers quicker, and the reason this is going to benefit you, we felt, a bit more than the science is because typically most ships are going to have access to more engineering-based powers than they might science powers. You're guaranteed that no matter what, you're pretty much going to have some type of engineering ability on a ship, whereas you can't guarantee as much science output, if that makes sense. Your engineering powers, you get a slew of them that can be used offensively or defensively. You've got some that are better offensive powers and some that are better defensive powers. So we felt that was a bit better of a toolkit to cater towards, at least for the final 2 points, than strictly the science. And it basically, that's not to say science powers are bad by any means, because a couple of the hosts do play science. It's just we felt that you're going to benefit more powers by going towards this than you would with strictly the science. But that's what we have for our basic skill tree. Some explanations we have there as to why we picked and didn't pick some of the skill points that we did. I hope that makes sense to you guys. If you have any questions as to why we picked certain points that we did, maybe something we didn't cover in the video here, let us know down below and say, hey, why not this point? Or why this thing? If you've got any questions, we'll do our best to answer them as much as we can. But anyways, like I was saying, we wanted to get this out there for you guys, explain in some good detail as to why we picked the certain skill points that we did, and I hope you guys have found this informative. Like I said, let us know if you have any questions. We'll do our best to answer them. But for now, folks, this is the Pilot Review Show, and we are warping out of here.